Yet for some reason, around noon, the name of another girl who hadn't even seen Nolan in a year was given to the patrol to go interview, saying that she was with that group, not Katie. They also gave the name of a couple of other friends who they weren't able to get in contact with. And despite having a picture of a text message from Katie, funny how you didn't share that with Officer Tatum. Probably could have cleared up some stuff real quick, right? Now let's get to the data. Now, at about 1:30 on July 5th, they were doing a flight of drones based on the relation of the last known anchor position of the Atkinson vessel, which I have documented right here. 4:30, Officer Strickland contacted Jennifer Pyrone, who was Wyatt's mother, who told them that he had already spoken to officers earlier in that day, but they were happy to cooperate with any investigation. And she let this officer take a picture of the GPS. Officer Strickland observed the track line showing Pyrone's vessel location on Horn Island, then gave coordinates. I'm going to need you to remember this exact phrasing. It's going to be important later on. Now, this was the GPS coordinates from the picture that the officer took, meaning that these coordinates had to be a different one that was verbally given over the phone by Wyatt. And you'll notice they're quite different. Now, you'll notice that this incident report says the involved entities are Bart Edmington and Jerry Adkerson, not Wyatt. Even though Wyatt is 18, he should be on this report. And you could argue that they were just giving the names of the people that owned the boats, but somehow I doubt that 21-year-old Bart owns that boat. You'll notice on this report that 2 different pieces of GPS evidence were collected. So now we're going to go to the July 8th report where they came and they took those GPS coordinates from both the Adkerson boat and Bart's boat. Yellow is Bart, blue is the grandfather Jerry. You know, the same Jerry that called and canceled the sea tow as the sea tow phone call was being made. Now, mind you, this is 3 days after the police had come and spoken to the mother and gotten the GPS coordinates. Now, Bart had a germane GPS map chart plotter. Jerry's boat also contained a germane GPS map chart plotter. Now, I had to look up the difference between waypoints, tracks, and routes. So waypoints mark specific spots. Routes connect them in a planned order, and tracks record your actual path. Now, according to that GPS data, there is no movement from 11 to 4:30, but we know that not.
There is another question surrounding the Nolan Wells investigation that hasn't received nearly as much attention as the cell phone, the dispatch audio, or the conflicting accounts from the people who were with him. What happened to the security cameras? More specifically, questions have circulated online about cameras at or around the home connected to Nolan's grandparents, and whether any surveillance footage was unavailable during the crucial period surrounding his disappearance. But here's the important distinction. I could not find a credible public report confirming that the grandparents' cameras actually went dark. No publicly available law enforcement statement I found establishes that the cameras were deliberately disabled, shut off, or tampered with. So why has this become a question at all? Because surveillance footage can be incredibly important in an investigation like this. Imagine investigators trying to reconstruct Nolan's movements after he returned from Horn Island. A camera recording could potentially establish when someone arrived at a house, when someone left, who entered, who was carrying something, or even whether a particular vehicle appeared at a certain time. And if a camera system wasn't recording during a period investigators consider important, detectives would naturally want to know why. That doesn't automatically mean anything suspicious happened. Cameras fail. Internet connections go down. Storage systems become full. Power can be interrupted. Recordings can also be overwritten automatically. But investigators would still want to establish exactly what happened to the footage. And that's why the question deserves to be separated into 2 parts. Was there actually a period when the cameras weren't recording? And if there was, why? Those are very different questions from claiming that someone intentionally shut the cameras off. So far, the public evidence doesn't establish the second claim. What we do know is that Nolan's family has raised serious questions about the evidence surrounding his final hours. His cell phone returned to shore without him, and his mother said the family found missing Snapchat content when they examined the phone. She said there were no saved pictures or snaps from July 4th, despite Nolan's habit of taking photos and videos at social gatherings. That concern eventually became part of the family's push for additional digital evidence. And that is important, because surveillance footage and cell phone data can work together. A phone might tell investigators where someone was. A camera might show who was physically present. A GPS record might establish a vehicle's movement. A witness might provide the context. When all four agree, the timeline becomes much stronger. When they don't, investigators have a problem they need to solve. That's exactly why the question about the cameras cannot simply be dismissed or exaggerated. If investigators have surveillance footage from the relevant locations, they can examine it alongside the other evidence. If footage is missing, they can potentially determine whether the absence has an ordinary technical explanation. And if there are records showing when a camera system was activated, disconnected, or accessed, those records could become relevant as well. But there's another reason this matters. Nolan's family has already questioned whether the public account of his final movements fully explains what happened. His parents have said they don't believe Nolan would simply choose to stay behind on Horn Island without his phone. That doesn't prove foul play, but it explains why the family continues asking investigators to examine every available source of evidence. The official investigation remains ongoing. Authorities have not publicly named a suspect in Nolan's death, and the cause and manner of death from the family's independent autopsy were reported as undetermined. So when we hear a question like, "Did the grandparents' house cameras go dark?" the responsible question isn't immediately, "Who turned them off?" It's, "Was there actually a gap in the recordings? What time did it occur? Which cameras were affected? Was there a technical explanation? And most importantly, does the missing footage overlap with any part of Nolan Wells' timeline that investigators are still trying to explain? Because if the answer to that final question turns out to be yes, then the cameras could become another piece of a much larger puzzle. And that puzzle is still missing some very important pieces, but there's another side to the camera question that makes it even more interesting. Even if surveillance footage was missing, investigators would still have another question to answer. Was the camera system actually recording at the time Nolan's movements became important? Because there's a huge difference between a camera that was deliberately disabled and a camera that simply wasn't functioning. And without the underlying system records, nobody should pretend those two things are the same. A security camera system can stop recording for ordinary reasons. A power interruption, a failed hard drive, a disconnected network, storage reaching capacity, a software problem, or even a camera being configured to record only when motion is detected. That's why investigators would need more than the footage itself. They could examine the system's logs. When was the last successful recording? Something has changed in the Nolan Wells investigation. Stop communicating? For weeks. Was the camera physically focused on Nolan's final movements? Was there a power interruption? The people who were with him on Horn Island? Did someone access the system? And the different accounts of what happened before he disappeared. Those technical details can sometimes answer questions that a missing video cannot. Is putting Nolan's friends under a much closer spotlight. The Nolan Wells case becomes particularly complicated. And the most important question isn't whether investigators are already trying to reconstruct a timeline using multiple independent sources have previously been told. GPS because there's a major difference between those two things. The emergency dispatch can raise a question, and forensic evidence. And a surveillance camera could potentially provide another independent timestamp. Let's go back to the beginning. Imagine, for example, that a camera showed Nolan arriving somewhere at a specific time. What was supposed to be a holiday gathering compared eventually turned into a massive search after Nolan displaced him in the same location. His body was later recovered, and investigators were left trying to reconstruct somewhere else while the camera appears to show him at the house. From the beginning, Nolan's investigators have provided accounts of what they say happened. And contradictions aren't automatically evidence of a crime. Some have denied rumors. They are signals that something needs to be explained. Hours in That's interviews. An important distinction in this case. But as more evidence has become available, the internet has already turned many unanswered questions into information that doesn't depend on someone's memory. Is one example. GPS data. The viral dispatch audio is another. witness
And now the
accounts,
camera question is
dispatch
becoming
audio,
part of that same conversation.
forensic evidence. But
And
investigators
that's where
have
the
to
latest
work
development
differently.
becomes important.
They have to establish
because
what
when
actually
investigators
happened
compare a
before
person's
deciding
statement
what
with
it means.
independent evidence,
And there's another
even a
question
small
surrounding
difference
the
can become
cameras
significant.
that could be even
Take
more
the
important.
timeline.
Who had
One of
access
the biggest
to them?
questions surrounding the case,
If a camera
has
system
always
really
been
did stop
exactly
recording,
when Nolan was
investigators
last
would want to
seen
know who
and what
normally
happened
controlled
after
the
that
system.
moment. Was it
Warren
accessible
Hudson
remotely?
has publicly
Was there a
described
mobile
seeing
application
Nolan around 3 p.m.
Was the system connected
He has
to
also
Wi-Fi?
discussed why he believes
Were
Nolan
there
remained
automatic
on the
settings?
island. And
But
were there
investigators
logs
showing
still
when
have to
anyone
establish what
accessed the
happened
system?
after Warren's last
Those
direct
details
sighting.
could potentially
There have
establish
been
whether a
reports of
gap
a later
in the footage
sighting
was
of Nolan,
completely ordinary,
including an account
or
placing
whether
him on
something
the
unusual
island
around
occurred.
6 p.m.
But at this
If that
point,
sighting can
the
be
public doesn't have enough verified
it would
information
extend the
to make
timeline
that determination.
considerably. There
And
has
that
been
creates
no
another
publicly
question.
confirmed
Who was
finding that
Nolan
someone
with during
deliberately
those missing
disabled
hours?
surveillance cameras
That's
connected
where the
to
new
Nolan's
evidence could become
grandparents'
important.
house. Because
And that's why this
investigators aren't
question
simply
should
looking
remain
at
a
what
question,
people said,
not a conclusion.
They're looking for something
Meanwhile,
that can
Nolan's
independently
family continues
confirm
pushing
or challenge
investigators
those
to examine
statements.
every possible
A cell
source of
phone
information
location,
surrounding
a
his
photograph,
final hours.
a message.
Their concern
A
has never
witness
been
who
limited
remembers
to
the
one
same
piece of
event.
evidence, a GPS record.
They want the entire timeline
anything that can
reconstructed,
establish where Nolan actually was. Who he was
And
with.
there's another major issue.
What happened to his phone?
Nolan's phone.
What witnesses
His family
actually
has
saw?
raised concerns
and
about
what
digital
happened between the
content
last
they believe
confirmed
was missing
sightings
from the device
and the discovery of his body.
Warren and other
That's
friends
why
have
something as
denied
simple as
deleting
a security
information
camera
or doing
could
anything
potentially
improper
matter.
with Nolan's phone.
One timestamp could
Those
confirm a
competing
witness.
claims cannot be resolved
Another could
by social
contradict
media
one.
arguments.
A vehicle
They
could be
require forensic
identified.
examination.
A person could be
If
seen
investigators
entering or
determine
leaving.
that information
Or
disappeared
the footage
because
could
of
ultimately
ordinary
show
technical
nothing relevant
circumstances,
at all.
that tells
And
one
there's the
story.
possibility that the
If they
cameras
find
were working
evidence that
perfectly
someone
and
deliberately
the entire
accessed or altered
went dark
information,
claim is simply
that
another
raises
rumor
another
that
question.
grew online. But even
That
then,
possibility has to
investigators
remain
would
on the
still
table
need to
too.
determine who did it,
Because
when
until
it happened,
investigators
and why,
or reliable
that's
records
the difference between a lead
establish
and a
what
conclusion.
happened. We simply
and this
don't
case
know.
has produced plenty of
But
leads.
if authorities eventually
the viral
confirm
emergency
that
audio
there was
is
a
another
surveillance
example.
gap during a critical part
People
of
have
Nolan's
spent countless
timeline,
hours trying
then
to
the next
identify
question
voices
will be
in the
unavoidable.
background. Some believe
What
they
caused
hear
the gap?
Nolan's name,
and that could
Others
make the
believe
camera
they hear
records
someone
far
asking
more
whether he is
important than
dead.
anyone initially
But investigators
realized.
have not
The
publicly
camera
confirmed
question
those interpretations.
may sound like a small detail.
Professional audio
But in an
analysis has to
investigation
begin
where the
with
timeline
original
is still
recording,
being reconstructed,
not edited clips
small details
circulating
can become
online.
very important.
If the original audio
Because
reveals something
investigators
significant,
aren't simply asking
investigators
whether a
can
camera
compare it
recorded
against the
something.
timeline.
They're
If
asking
it
whether
doesn't,
the available
then the recording
evidence
may
can
simply
establish
remain
where
another
Nolan
unresolved
was,
piece of
who
evidence.
was around him,
and
what
that's why the
happened
new
during the
evidence
hours that
surrounding
remain
Nolan's
unclear.
friends matters.
And that brings
Not
us
because
back
it
to the central
automatically
problem.
proves anyone did
There are
anything
still
wrong.
gaps in the timeline.
But because investigators
Nolan was
now
with
have
friends
more
on
information
Horn
to
Island.
compare against the
At some
stories that
point,
have
he
already
became
been
separated
told.
from the group.
And if those stories
His
don't
friends
match the
eventually
evidence,
returned without him.
someone will eventually
His
have
body
to
was
explain
later
why.
recovered.
But this
But
is
the
where the
exact
story gets
sequence
more
of events
complicated.
between those moments
because
remains
when
the subject
investigators
of
begin
intense
comparing
investigation
witness statements
and public
with
debate.
independent evidence,
That's why
they aren't
every
looking for
possible
one
source of
dramatic
evidence
contradiction.
matters.
They're
camera,
looking for patterns,
a cell phone,
a difference in timing,
a GPS record,
a missing message,
a witness,
a location that
dispatch
doesn't
recording,
make sense.
Each
A
one can
statement that
potentially
changes
confirm
between
another.
interviews.
And if
Any one of
investigators
those
discover that
details
one
could have an
source
innocent
contradicts another,
explanation. They have to
but when
determine
several
why.
details begin pointing
Now
in the same
imagine
direction,
the cameras at the grandparents'
investigators
house
have
were
to take a
operating
much
normally.
closer look. If investigators
That's why
have
the
footage
timeline
covering the
surrounding
relevant
Nolan's
period,
final
that
hours
footage could
remains
potentially
so
help
important.
establish whether
Warren
Nolan
has
arrived at the
publicly
property,
described seeing
who was
Nolan
present,
around 3
and what
p.m.
happened afterward.
He has explained why
But
he
if the
believes
cameras
Nolan
weren't
decided to
recording,
stay behind.
then investigators
And
would
he has
need to
discussed what
establish
happened
exactly
as the
why.
group prepared to leave
And
Horn
that's
Island.
where system records
But
become
investigators
important.
still have to establish
missing
what
recording
happened
doesn't
after that
necessarily
last
mean
direct
someone
sighting.
deliberately
The
erased
reported
it.
later sighting
The
around
system
6
could have
p.m.
malfunctioned.
is particularly
The
important.
storage could have been overwritten.
If Nolan was
the internet
actually
connection
seen alive
could have
at that
failed.
time,
There
then
could
the
have been
window
a power
investigators
interruption,
need to reconstruct
or the cameras
becomes
may
much
simply
larger.
not have been configured
and
to
that
record
means there could be
continuously.
information that hasn't
Without
yet been made
technical
public.
evidence, there is
Who
no
was nearby irresponsible way to choose one explanation over another. Did anyone photograph him? The cameras went dark. needs
Did
to
a
be
GPS
treated carefully.
record place him somewhere?
Until investigators confirm exactly what happened
by watching another
it's an
interview.
unanswered question.
They require
not
evidence,
proof of foul play.
and that's why Nolan's
and there's
digital
another
records
reason
could
the
become
distinction
one of the most
matters.
important parts
The
of the
Nolan Wells
investigation.
case has already
His
generated
phone has
enormous
already
amounts
become
of
the subject
online
of intense
speculation.
public discussion.
People have
Nolan's
analyzed
family
audio
has
clips,
raised concerns
they've
about
dissected
missing digital
interviews.
content.
They've
The friends
debated
connected to the
cell phone
case
records.
have denied
They've
deleting
questioned
information
witnesses.
or interfering with
and
the
now
device.
they're examining surveillance cameras.
Those are competing claims.
But the more complicated
But
the case
investigators
becomes,
have tools
the more
that can
important it
potentially
is to
determine what
separate
happened
what
to
is
the
known
data.
from what people
Digital
suspect.
forensic specialists
What is
can
known
examine
is that
activity
investigators
associated
continue
with
examining
devices and
evidence
accounts,
surrounding Nolan's
including
death.
timestamps
What is
and
not
access
publicly
information.
established is that surveillance
If the records
cameras at
show
his
nothing
grandparents' house
unusual,
were deliberately
that could help
disabled.
resolve one
Those
part
are
of the
two very
controversy.
different statements.
If they reveal
Meanwhile,
unexplained activity,
Nolan's family
investigators
continues
would have
seeking
another
answers.
lead to follow.
Their questions go
But
far
even
beyond the
unexplained
cameras.
activity
They want
isn't
investigators
automatically
to
proof of a
establish
crime.
Nolan's final movements.
Investigators
They
still
want the
need to
digital
establish
evidence
who
examined.
had access
They want
and what
witness
actually
statements
occurred.
compared.
Then
And
there's
they want
the audio.
every unexplained detail
The emergency
addressed.
dispatch
That
recording
is why
remains
the
one of the
surveillance
most
question
discussed
matters,
pieces of evidence
even if
in
the
the
cameras
entire case.
ultimately turn out to have
People
nothing to do
online
with
have created
Nolan's
their
death.
own interpretations
If the
of the
footage
background
exists,
voices.
investigators
Some
can
believe
examine
the
it.
recording
If
contains
it doesn't,
Nolan's name.
investigators can
Others
determine
believe
why.
they hear a question about
Either
whether he is
outcome
dead.
provides information.
But those interpretations
and
have not been
sometimes
publicly
proving that a
confirmed by
suspected piece of
investigators.
evidence doesn't contain
And forensic
anything
audio
significant
experts have warned
is just as
that
important as
processed or
finding
compressed
something that
recordings
does.
can sound very
The
different from the
investigation
original.
also has to consider
That's
the medical
why the
evidence.
original recording matters.
The independent
If
autopsy
investigators can
commissioned by
reliably
Nolan's
identify
family
a voice,
was unable to
determine what
establish
was
a
said,
definitive
and
cause or
establish
manner
when
of
it was
death.
said,
The
that
recording
means
could become
investigators
extremely
cannot simply
valuable.
assume what happened,
But if the audio
based on the
isn't clear
circumstances
enough,
surrounding
detectives
Nolan's
will have to
disappearance.
rely on the other evidence.
They have to reconstruct the
and that
events
brings us back to
independently.
the friends.
And
The
that makes
fact that
the timeline
investigators
even
are
more
examining their
important.
statements does
Where
not
was
mean
Nolan?
investigators have
Who saw
concluded
him?
they committed a crime.
When did they see him?
It means their
What
accounts
happened
are part of the
afterward?
timeline.
And can those
And
answers
every
be
timeline
independently
has to be
verified?
If Warren's
Those
account
are the
matches
questions
the
that
GPS
could eventually
data,
determine
that's
the
important.
direction of the investigation.
If another friend's account
So,
matches cell phone
did the
records,
grandparents'
that's
cameras
important.
actually go
If
dark?
a witness describes
The publicly
seeing Nolan
available
at a particular
evidence does
time
not currently
and that sighting
establish
can
that
be
they were deliberately
independently
confirmed,
confirmed, that's important
But
too.
if investigators
But
confirm
if two
that there was a
accounts cannot
surveillance
both be
gap
true,
during a critical
then
period,
investigators
the
have to
reason for
determine
that gap
why.
will become another
That's where
question
this
they
case
need to
could
answer.
eventually turn. If
Not
investigators
on one
eventually obtain the
sensational
complete
statement,
surveillance records,
not on a viral
the first
video,
thing they would need to establish
but on whether
is
the evidence
surprisingly
confirms
simple.
the stories people
Was
have
the
been
system
telling.
actually recording?
And as more
that
records
means
become
examining
available,
the camera's operating
investigators
history,
may finally
storage
be able
system,
to close some of the
timestamps,
biggest gaps
and
in
any
Nolan's
available access
timeline.
logs. Because the
If the
question
system was
isn't
working
simply
normally,
whether Nolan's
investigators
friends have been
could then
exposed.
review the footage surrounding the
The real
relevant
question
period.
is much more important,
And they wouldn't
did
necessarily
the new
be looking
evidence
for something
actually
dramatic.
contradict what they told
Sometimes
investigators?
the most important thing
If it
on a
did,
surveillance
the next
recording is
question will
simply
be
a
impossible
timestamp.
to avoid.
A person
Why?
arriving.
And
A
this is where
vehicle
the
leaving.
investigation reaches
Someone
its most
entering a
important
house.
question. Someone
What
carrying a
happens when the
particular
stories
item,
people have been telling
or even
are placed
proof
next
that
to
a
the
person
evidence?
wasn't where another
Because a
witness
witness
said
can
they were.
remember something incorrectly.
That's why surveillance footage
A
can be so
timestamp can
valuable
clarify
in
it.
reconstructing a
cell phone
timeline.
record can challenge it.
But there's another
A
possibility.
GPS record can confirm
What
it.
if the cameras
And
really
a
weren't
forensic
recording?
finding can
Then
completely change how investigators
would
would
need to
understand
determine exactly
timeline.
when the interruption
That's
occurred
why the latest
and why.
evidence involving Nolan's
Was there a
friends
power outage?
needs to be examined
Did the internet
carefully.
connection fail?
Not as proof of guilt.
Did the recording device
But
run
as a
out
way
of
of
storage?
determining whether their
Was
accounts
the system
remain consistent
accessed
with
remotely?
everything investigators
Or was
have
there
discovered?
some other technical
Start with the
explanation?
timeline.
Those
Warren
questions
has
can
publicly
sometimes be
described
answered
seeing
through
Nolan
system
around 3
logs
p.m.
and other digital records.
There is also a reported later
And
sighting
if
that
investigators
investigators
find
would need
evidence
to
that
verify
someone
independently.
deliberately interfered with the
Those
system,
2 points
that would
create a
obviously
window
deserve much
that
closer
remains
examination.
critical.
To understanding
But
Nolan's
there
final
is an important
hours.
line that
If
cannot
the
be
later
crossed
sighting is
without
confirmed,
evidence.
investigators
A
have
missing
to
recording
determine
is not
exactly
automatically
where Nolan
proof
was,
that someone
who was
deliberately
around
turned
him,
off a camera,
and what happened
and
afterward.
a camera failure is
That's
certainly
where
not
digital
proof
evidence
that someone
could
was
become
involved
decisive.
in Nolan's death.
A cell phone
That's
doesn't
why the
simply provide
investigation
a
has to
conversation.
proceed step by
It can provide timestamps. The same principle applies
location
to every other
information,
disputed piece of
application
evidence in this
activity,
case. The cell phone,
photos,
the dispatch
messages,
audio, the
and
GPS
other
records that can help
the witness
reconstruct
statements.
events. The autopsy
If those records
findings
support the accounts given by
now,
Nolan's friends,
potentially,
some of the
surveillance
questions
footage.
surrounding their
Each
statements
source can
may
confirm
become
another,
easier to answer
or raise a contradiction.
But if the
that
records
investigators
contradict
have to
important
explain.
parts of those accounts,
For Nolan's family,
investigators
that's
will have
exactly
to examine
what they're
the
asking
discrepancy.
An
And
explanation.
that's the point people sometimes
They
miss.
want investigators to
A
reconstruct
contradiction
Nolan's
isn't
final
automatically
hours
a
as
confession.
completely as possible.
It's a
and
question.
determine what happened after he became
Investigators then have
separated
to
from his
determine
friends.
whether there's an innocent
And
explanation
if surveillance footage
or whether the
exists,
contradiction
it could
points
potentially
towards
help
something more
answer
serious.
part of that question.
The same applies
But if
to
it
the
doesn't
emergency
exist,
audio.
investigators
The
still
internet
need
has
to know
already
why.
reached its own conclusions
That's the
about
unanswered
what certain
question at the heart
background
of this
voices
entire
supposedly
discussion.
say.
Did the
But
cameras actually
investigators
go
can't
dark?
operate that way.
At this point,
They
the
need the
publicly
original
available
recording.
evidence does not
They
establish
need
that they were
forensic
deliberately
analysis.
disabled.
And they need
So
to know
until
whether
investigators
the words people
release
believe they're
verified
hearing
information
can
about the
actually
camera
be
system,
established
claims that
scientifically.
someone intentionally shut
the
the
audio
cameras
eventually
off should
confirms an
remain
important
allegations,
statement,
not
that
facts.
information can be added
What
to
we
the
can say
timeline.
is that surveillance
If it doesn't,
records,
if
then
available,
the viral
could
interpretations
become another
remain
valuable piece
speculation.
of the timeline.
Meanwhile,
And
Nolan's
the timeline
family
may
continues
ultimately
waiting
be
for
what
answers.
determines whether the different
For them,
accounts
the central
surrounding
issue
Nolan's
isn't
final
whether one
hours can
person
be
wins an
reconciled.
argument online,
Because the truth
it's whether
won't come
investigators
from the
can
most
explain
convincing
what
theory.
happened to Nolan
It will
after
come
he
from
was
the
last
evidence
seen
that
alive.
survives scrutiny.
That means determining
If you've
where
been
he
following
was,
the Nolan Wells
who he was with,
investigation, tell
what
us in the
happened to
comments.
his phone.
Do you think
What the
investigators should witnesses
focus
actually
more
saw,
attention on surveillance
and
footage
ultimately
and digital records,
what caused his
or are the
death?
witness statements and
Those
forensic
questions
evidence
remain
more
connected.
important? And remember
that's
to
why
subscribe
every new
for future
piece of evidence
evidence-based
matters.
updates as
The
new verified
investigation
information
doesn't need
becomes
one
available.
spectacular discovery.
It needs enough independently verified evidence to establish what happened beyond reasonable doubt if criminal charges are eventually brought. For now, however, the public should be careful about turning investigative questions into accusations. No public evidence currently establishes that Nolan's friends killed him. And unless authorities announce otherwise, allegations circulating online remain allegations. What the evidence may eventually show is still being determined. Perhaps the friends' accounts will ultimately be supported. Perhaps investigators will discover inconsistencies that require further explanation. Or perhaps the most important evidence hasn't even been released yet. That's what makes the next stage of this investigation so important. Because once investigators finish comparing the digital evidence, witness statements, audio, GPS information, and forensic findings, they'll have a much clearer picture of Nolan's final hours. And that is when the unanswered questions may finally begin turning into answers. So the question isn't simply, did Nolan's friends get exposed? The real question is, what does the evidence actually prove? Until that answer comes from investigators, that's the question everyone following this case should keep asking. If you found this documentary informative, share your thoughts in the comments. Which piece of evidence do you think could be most important? The cell phone records, GPS data, witness statements, dispatch audio, or the forensic findings? And subscribe for future updates as verified information becomes available.